So we are so pleased to be able to offer the Filmmaker's Choice Award to Sam Pollard. Yay, Sam.
I want to thank the Hampton Doc Film Festival for giving me this great honor. It's really appreciated. I love coming out here to get this and to see a lot of old colleagues and friends, Roger Sherman, Don Lenza, Nigel Noble, and some of my NYU colleagues, Ken Dansinger. And it's a real pleasure. I'm looking forward to the feedback and the Q&A with Larry Maslin, another colleague from NYU. And I want to really thank you again, thank the festival for giving me this Film Choice Award. Thank you.
I'm Larry Maslin. I'm a co-producer and the writer of the documentary, and I'm also the host of a WPPB radio show every Sunday at 3 called Broadway to Main Street. And I have this, it's an hour of like show tunes and stuff, and I always manage to sneak Sammy Davis Jr. in somehow. And last week I had a hour about the Marx Brothers, and I managed to get Sammy Davis Jr. into that. Don't ask, but I did. And a friend of mine at work says, is there anything you won't do to get Sammy Davis Jr. on the air? And I just want to introduce Sam Pollard by saying Sam Pollard did everything to get Sammy Davis Jr. on the air in this documentary. So I'm personally very grateful, and I hope you are too. This was an American Masters project. It began with the executive producer, Michael Cantor, who I worked with, and for years we've been trying to do something about Sammy, and we knew that really one person could helm it and give it the sort of gravitas and arc and I think narrative depth that it has, and that was Sam Pollard. What do you remember about Sammy growing up?
Before I talk about what I remember about Sammy, I would be remiss if I didn't sort of give a shout out to the gentleman who edited the film, who's out here, Steve Wexler. Did a wonderful job. Where is he? Okay. All right. Longtime colleague. In answering your question, Larry, I mean, I think back to 1961. I was 11 years old. And I remember on Sunday nights, like a lot of people in the United States, I would watch the Ed Sullivan Show. And I would see, every once in a while, there'd be Sammy Davis Jr. on the Ed Sullivan Show singing and dancing and doing impressions and playing musical instruments. And I would say, wow. Then I would see him a few years later on the Hollywood Palace. Right. And then I remember seeing, you know, Ocean's 11 and Sergeant's 3 and Robin and Seven Hoods. And I was like a huge Sammy Davis fan. And then when he came out with the autobiography, Yes, I Can, I think I was 16 years old when I first read it. And I was mesmerized at how complicated his life was. Right. But like a lot of people, Sammy sort of fell off of my chart in the 70s. I wasn't so into him as I got to be a young man. And being asked to direct this film gave me an opportunity now to go back and revisit the Sammy Davis I knew, Sammy Davis I didn't really know so much about, and just to see how complicated a human being he was, besides being a phenomenal entertainer.
Right.
You know.
Well, one of the things that I think makes your work so fascinating is you have a way of looking at the individual within the larger context of history. And there had been some Sammy Davis stuff out there, like on A&E Biography. It was all showbiz, and I think what I'm always mesmerized watching this, how many times I've seen it, your work and Steve's work, is how the trajectory of him as a performer through the cultural and political lens in the times in which he lived. And how did you balance that in terms of trying to keep, you know, some showbiz stuff, but there's obviously a lot of contextual stuff in this documentary?
Well, you know, as an African-American filmmaker and living through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and that's all a part of my experience. And, you know, being a filmmaker and always understanding that for me, when I'm making a film about someone like a Sammy Davis Jr. or August Wilson, I'm trying to create the historical context, you know, and trying to make sure you understand that it was just about this person not in terms of just from one perspective, but from a layered and complex perspective. So you can't understand Sammy Davis Jr. without understanding what life was like to be black in the 30s and 40s and 50s. You can't understand Sammy Davis Jr. and not understand what it meant for him to have to deal with, you know, the civil rights movement and Dr. King and SCLC. You can't understand Sammy Davis Jr. understanding how he reacted to going to Vietnam, how he reacted to Richard Nixon. All this was a part of his world, you know, contextual world. I mean, when we were going through the footage, just watching that footage with Sammy, you know, with Arsenio Hall and talking to the British gentleman about his experiences in the Army in World War II, you say, wow, you know, to him to really to be able to articulate those struggles he had to deal with every day as a black man in America is phenomenal. To listen to Sammy talk about his conversion to Judaism and how important it was to him spiritually, you know, it was like, wow, you know. It was just having an opportunity to see Sammy in so many different, from so many different perspectives. And the other thing that's really fascinating about Sammy Davis Jr. is, as Steve and I were sitting in the editing room every day, and you guys would come in, you and Michael would come look at the cuts, it was interesting to see how articulate Sammy was in understanding who he was, you know, who he was. It's rare to have someone be able to sort of have such a nuanced perspective about his own place in the world, and how people respond to him and how he responded to people, which is phenomenal to me.
But I guess that's a gift. I mean, when we were talking for how many years, 2.5, 3 years putting this together, what are you working on? Sammy Davis Jr. Oh, and you go, well, you're not going to have a lot of problems finding stuff with Sammy Davis Jr. in it. So was his prolific appearances in film, television, dating back to was that a blessing or a curse that there was so much footage of Sammy?
Well, it's always a little bit of a blessing and a curse, you know, because then you have to make the hard decisions of what to keep and what not to keep. But every once in a while you'll find something like, for example, that footage when Sammy is performing with the two drummers. Now, I had never seen that material. And when Steve and I first looked at it, the one thing we understood that sometimes you need to let the material play for itself. And when Steve cut that sequence together and just let Sammy dance, I remember saying, I thought the guy was a great dancer, but this was phenomenal. This was phenomenal in terms of his artistry as a dancer. You know, and then to have Billy Crystal dissect it and to have Whoopi Goldberg dissect it was really just fascinating to me. You know, because there was so much footage of Sammy. I mean, as I've said so many times before, Sammy Davis Jr. never said no to a camera, to an interview. He never said no. So there was like Dinah Shore, Mike Douglas, you know, everybody, you know. He was on everybody's show, and he would perform on every show. And there was footage of him in Italy, in France, everything. So it was sometimes difficult to make the hard choices. And you know the first assemblies, we had a lot of stuff that never made the cut. Him with Mike Wallace never made the cut.
No, I remember being in there and you saying, this is a 100-minute story. And you had enough discipline to know that 120 might have been fun because you'd have had 4 more clips of him doing his shtick or whatever, but it wouldn't have told the story as well. So that was pretty great.
And we did have a 120-minute show.
I remember it. We had a section at one point on Mr. Wonderful, which was a show he did in 1956 on Broadway with his dad and with Will Maston and Cheetah Rivera, and we had an amazing. We interviewed Cheetah, who didn't make the final cut, and at one point, well, not surprisingly, if you know either of them, she had an affair with him during Mr. Wonderful, and she said they were at Sardi's one night, and they got into some huge, intense argument, and Sammy, it's 1956, Sammy took out his eye and put it on the table and said, "Is that what you want from me? Is that what you want from me?" And I remember the minute we filmed Cheetah saying that, that's got to go in the documentary, and it didn't, because it just, you had a sense of where the story wanted to go, and you didn't get derailed by anecdotes and little fun. I guess that's in the bonus track reel when it comes out on DVD or something.
It didn't even make the bonus.
Oh, man. Well, I just told it to you.
I just watched the bonus material.
Yeah. I'll take some questions. Something I always like to ask. How many people in this audience saw him live? Great, that's fantastic. Well done. Great. Did you have a question, sir?
Just in the last couple of weeks, I started listening to a box set of these Capitol Records, Yes I Can, Sammy Davis Stewart.
Yeah, Warner. Yeah.
Warner.
Yep.
Thank you. I'm reading the booklet that's there, which has many essays, including from Lord Friedwald, and there was a mention, which I'd never known, that Sammy actually was part Cuban, not Puerto Rican.
That's right.
And considering the fact that his identity, that he really, he identified as he wished, I was wondering what your perspective was of why that doesn't usually come out. That's the only mention I've ever seen it, and I didn't see the mention in the film either.
I think he didn't talk about being Cuban because around that time we were dealing with Castro.
I'm aware of that, but
Yeah,
still,
he didn't deal with it. That's why he said he was Puerto Rican.
right.
He
Deal
didn't.
with Jewish identity, with
But he didn't say he was Cuban. I know, we all know he's Cuban too, but he didn't want to, I guess it was too sensitive for him.
I also think his relationship with his mother was quite strained until later on. So I think that was sort of just not a place he went to. He certainly had a number of other places to go to identity-wise. So he just didn't dip into that well as much.
And he really didn't spend much time with his mother until he became a young man, right?
Yeah.
His early 20s.
Yeah, because he was on the road.
He was raised by his father and his uncle.
Yes, the gentleman on the aisle.
How many children did he have, and what did you get in touch with them? Try to get in touch with them?
Yeah, Sam, did you try to get in touch with the children?
He had 3 children. He had a daughter, Tracy, and 2 sons that were adopted. And we reached out to Tracy really early in the project. And initially, there was some talk of having Tracy do an interview with My Brit, who's still alive, her mother. And we tried to set something up in Los Angeles, and that fell through. And then I had tried to get Tracy, who lives in Nashville, to just do a single interview. And she had consented to do an interview, and I flew out to Nashville. I had a crew drive from Memphis, and we met at, we had a location at a hotel in Nashville, and she was supposed to show up for the interview at 12:30. 12:30 came, there was no Tracy. 12:45, there was no Tracy. I called her home. 1:15, I sent the production assistant out to Tracy's house. There was no response. And as we sit here, I've never heard from Tracy Davis. She never showed up for the interview. And hopefully she'll see the film at some point.
I mean, he had, to say the least, a very strained relationship with his own family as well. When they divorced, Mai took the kids to California, and he spent the rest of his life sort of trying to form some kind of bond with his children. But it's interesting, a couple of things you heard were him talking somewhat garbled interview tapes, which exist in the Library of Congress, and where he was much more candid in the late 80s. And he said something like, I know, you have to understand, in 1964, 65 on Broadway, I was the king of Broadway. Show business was everything. My family life was an appendage to me. And, I just know every day what I should be doing is I should be taking the kids to the zoo. They want to be taken to the zoo by their dad. And he paused and he said, not that I want to go to the fucking zoo. So his priorities were professional, not personal, for a lot of his life.
Good term.
And it caught up with him. Yep.
Two quick questions. One is, it was a little bit of an odd camera angle on the Kim Novak interview.
Sam was not responsible for filming that interview.
But she did not want her chin to be, the double chin.
And the other thing is those photographs in the margin, are those all his?
They're all Sammy's.
That's another talent.
Yeah, he was a wonderful. Jerry Lewis gave him his first camera, because Jerry Lewis was also into cameras and is a great director. So yeah, Sammy loved to shoot pictures. We had lots of pictures they're Sammy's pictures. Some of those wonderful Kim Novak pictures are Sammy's.
And one of the reasons we were able to do the documentary is his son he adopted quite late in life, Manny, sort of made, do you have anything, a family, a legacy, legal, blah, blah, blah. He said, yeah, well, there are these 2 storage lockers in Burbank that haven't been opened for 30 years. And when Sammy died, he owed more money to the federal government than any individual in IRS history. True story. And they've worked it out, and we went with Manny with he undid the combination lock, and there were dozens upon thousands of photographs taken by Sammy, his complete scrapbooks from the 30s on. Everything sort of grinds to a halt around 1973, but the wealth of material you saw, which is fantastic, were Sammy's personal stuff. Yep.
Did the Sinatra thing just fall off the cliff at the stage you showed in the film, when Kennedy Sinatra thing?
No, they were still close. I mean, they had one of these very kind of complex relationships where they would have times where they would be really tight, and then they would have times where they would have a falling out. So, for example, when Sammy, which we don't really deal with, when Sammy was talking about the cocaine, he liked drug drinking, Sinatra stopped talking to him when he was doing the drugs. He fell out with him. And then they came back together. I mean, you know, for Sammy Davis Jr., Sinatra was his big brother. He loved Frank Sinatra. You know, they just had a very complex relationship. Sinatra was a difficult man himself, you know.
At the end, they hooked up again on a sort of Rat Pack reunion tour with Sinatra. Dean Martin left after the first thing, and Liza came in. And Sammy would sing, and this is the late 1980s, you know, he would sing, I gotta be me, I wanna be him, but I gotta be me. So he had that love affair with Sinatra continued to his dying day. Somebody here had a question, yeah.
Concerning his photography, right after Jerry Lewis gave him the camera, a close friend of his says, hey Sammy, what are you doing taking pictures? You only have one eye. To which he retaliated and he says, well, the camera only has one eye.
That's right.
That was beautiful. We might have time for one more. Anything? I can't see. Yeah, go ahead.
We did. We wanted to try to interview Maya Britt, but she wouldn't consent to an interview unless her daughter was there. And her daughter, Tracy, was difficult to get to have her sit
She
down in
was
front
in,
of the camera.
what, Santa Fe, Los Angeles, somewhere in the West,
She's
right?
in California.
Yeah. I should add that this documentary's been making the film festival circuit. It will be broadcast as part of American Masters Tuesday, February 19th at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, who knows?
9 o'clock.
9 o'clock, so
Tell all your friends.
tell all your friends. Thanks.